Okay, today we're going to get started by looking at pre-colonial African development. Before any era, before any Asian period, whether they were Arab, European, or from Southern Asia, Indian, whatever, arrived in Africa, how did we engage in nation building? How did we develop our communities? Before any of these people. And that is what chapter 2 of Walter Rodney gets into. Chapter 2, which is entitled How Africa Developed Before the Coming of Europeans up to the 15th century, he specifically goes back into history. But before we do all of that, got a couple of questions. Before we look at history as it relates to development here in Africa, question we want to answer: are we connected to our collective past? Because if we say, well, are we connected to our African past? That's the first question. And then the next part of it is, if we are, how are we connected? And on the other hand, if we say that we are not, why do we say that we are not connected? So before we do any discussion about history, let's kind of think about that question. Are we connected to the past? Are we in any way connected to our past? All right. I heard a yes. Why, my favorite question, do you say yes?
If we look at the current situation which is existing nowadays, for instance, let us talk about poverty. And let's check about the economic system that we have in Africa. For instance, let's talk about our own mother country, for instance, Tanzania. But we have got an economic system of which it is not stable. And if you go and you try to figure out the reason why, the answer comes back that the reason behind is due to some of the colonial legacies that were left behind. And for instance, today we talk about on how to improve and overcome such kind of obstacles. The first thing we have to go and press we have to press back the history that people before they were doing 1, 2, 3, 4. And then as for now, we have to figure out, we have to start a new economic plan. Without those problems to be connected with our past, we couldn't try even to figure out about what happened before. Rather, today we are talking about wars. And this civil war which happened in Africa is due to some of the countries which were laid down. For instance, we have such as boundaries, and a good example which is existing today is that the current situation between Tanzania and Malawi. We have so-called a certain conflict concerning the boundary, and this is due to the sum of the issue which was traced at the back. Then not only that, also we have got so-called Neo-Colonialism, which is existing in Africa. That Africans have got their own economic background, and they have different activities in Africa. But there are certain obstacles that once they want to do trade with other countries, especially Western countries, they face some of the difficulties in terms of putting some of their own price. Rather, they find themselves that people from outside are the ones who have their own price for those goods, but not Africans. So we are totally connected with this. Not only that, also we have so-called, if we go back and look about this history of slavery in Africa, is due to the sum of the problems which were associated with the colonialism in Africa. So in one way or another, we can see that these things are connected.
Does anyone disagree with me? Anybody? So silence means everybody agrees. Yeah. All right. We are connected to our past, and he gives you all the reasons that we're connected that Rodney gives you in chapter 2 of his book. The exact same reasons. Now I ask that question because we need to make sure we understand that we are actually connected to the history. And I'm going to add on to what he just told you. Because he told you about Neo-Colonialism. He told you about that connection. He tells you about the period of enslavement and how that leads to the current problems that we have here. So now, we are connected to our past, and Western scientists in the United States and in Europe have looked at it at the genetic level to show that you're more connected to the past than you think. And that comes out of the science of epigenetics. Now, when you took a genetics course in secondary school, you pretty much learned that, your parents get together and introduce you, and that you have a hereditary connection to them. You look like some people in your family. I remember looking finding a very old picture of a great uncle that I had passed on already. And when I looked at the picture, I was like, wow, I look just like him. So, we understand the genetic connection as far as DNA is concerned. So that you get certain eye colors, physical shape, voice, all of those things. But the science of epigenetics tells you that you're connected to the past even deeper than that. The BBC Discovery did an interesting show on epigenetics. And what they found was that the experiences of our ancestors are having a direct impact upon us. In the study, what they saw was they went to a village somewhere in Northern Europe where the people were pretty much remotely isolated for the most part. And they were studying medical records and death records. And what they found was that the diet, the things that someone ate in 1900 was affecting their great-great-grandchildren. So, and to sum up what they were saying here, everything that you do, every action that you take or the things that affect you traumatically. Let's suppose you had been in Dar es Salaam in 1996 when Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda blew up. They bombed the embassies. You remember that, right? Suppose you had been there and you were a woman and you were pregnant. However you reacted to that, the effect that incident would have had on you would have been transferred to your child. And not only to the child that you were carrying, but it would have also been transferred to the second, the third, and the fourth generations. So we are very connected. I'm coming out of the West, coming out of the United States. I'm an 8th generation descendant of a West African Fulani man who was enslaved in the 1700s. So I'm an 8th generation descendant. The things that affected him then are still having an effect on me. Because 7 of those 8 generations had to deal with the trauma of slavery. So epigenetics rolls down through us. And so that gives us an even deeper connection. Because what we do doesn't just affect us, it's going to affect those who come after us for at least 4 generations. And that goes for disease issues, whatever health issues, whatever mental issues, all of these things are carried. And that connects us to the past. Why do I mention that? Because only 2 generations ago, the entire continent was what? Colonized. So the things that were traumatic for people then are still connected to us. I mean, we're still dealing with that. We're connected to them, and it's affecting us at a spiritual level, at a mental level, at a physical level. Very key. And a good example of it is how you feel when you begin to read about the trauma that occurred then. When you read the story, suppose you were from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and you were reading about what had occurred during the period when Belgium and King Leopold were in control of the Congo. Forced labor, people that weren't collecting or mining enough of whatever, having limbs hacked off. So if you were from the DRC, and even though none of that had happened to you, but you were reading about it, because of the epigenetic connection, you're going to actually feel something with regards to that. It becomes painful to look at. So we're connected. And I say we are connected, and that's how. We're connected at the genetic level. You're connected at the social level, which is what he explained to you. When you look at the social events, the government that you have now, all of those institutions were created during the colonial period. The industries that are currently existing in the country, which are geared toward the international economic arena, were set up during the colonial period. So that's the social connection. But we're also connected at the genetic level. So we are connected. And so that should give us a better understanding of why it is important when studying development, as the class outline that the university has, and as Walter does, why they go back into history. And not just history, but prehistory. Now, I have up here pre-colonial African development from 8000 BCE to 1500 BCE. First thing I want us to do is we're going to look at the African model for social organization. We're going to look at our model for social organization. How do we set up societies? How do we develop societies? Now it's very important that we go back to that point to begin with. The reason being, if we don't go back to our own cultural foundations, if we don't go back and look at how we did things, we will end up taking ideas that are completely against everything that we're about. If we try to wholesale just bring in European economics, development is all about economics. So if we just try to take the European model and bring it here, what Walter Rodney is telling you in chapter 2, you're running into problems. So we need to go back into our own history and not look at the dates and whatnot, but now we're looking at the institutions that we as a people put together to develop a society. Because if you, as holders of Juris Doctorates, are going to effectively participate in the development of Tanzania, you're going to have a firm grasp of how the peoples of Tanzania, before colonialism, developed their society. Because that has to be the basis. When you look at capitalism as its practice, that is completely founded on European society's development. And it answers to their cultural needs, their cultural values, all of that. So when we look at the African way of going about it, we have to start with the compound, the family compound. And Walter Rodney tells you in chapter 2 at the very beginning of his book that everything about African social organization begins with the family. And not a nuclear family like in the West, man, wife, and 2.3 children. But we're talking about an extended family in the African sense. So it's the family compound. We begin automatically with the family compound. And so, economics in an African traditional sense is compound management. And the compound consists of you've got the man, the wife, the children. You've got several of the extended families, brothers and sisters. You know, it's very large. The compound also contains whatever farming material or equipment that the family is using. All of these things. So, and it's all based on kinship. If you go to the library and you start reading some of the old European studies of Africa, because before you can colonize people, before you can dominate people, before you can conquer people, you want to study those people in detail. And when you look at those studies that the Europeans wrote in the early 1900s, the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were very detailed. They were breaking down African society because they had to see how could they transform a society that was based on self-sufficiency and doing for self and make it dependent. And in order to make a society dependent, you first got to understand what that society is all about. And so they wrote some racist stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff in there that's racist. Everything is primitive and savage and all this other foolishness. But like Walter Rodney tells you, we have to be careful when we start looking at Europe as an example and saying European civilization. Because he's like, hold up, these are the same people that engaged in slavery. These are the same people that engaged in genocide. They engaged in genocide in New Zealand. You go to Australia, in Australia, they engaged in genocide in New Zealand. You don't even see the Tasmanians anymore. They turned, the New Zealanders turned the killing of the Tasmanians into a sport. Paid you a lot of money for every Tasmanian head or for some body part that you brought in as proof that you had killed Tasmanians. That's genocide. In the Americas, when you look at North America, the United States, and you see it stretches from sea to shining sea, but before, there were millions of Native Americans who were there, the indigenous peoples. There were millions of them. Not that many of them now. That's genocide. And it's documented. It's not like this is hidden. So if you got people who engage in genocide, who put together an economic system that leaves the large majority of its population with nothing, that's probably not the best example of civilization. And that's what Walter Rodney points out. And so when you read those old stories, you'll see the Europeans, when they're writing studies about us, you see them use terms primitive and barbarism. You just ignore all of that. Because that's all part of the racist verbiage that they use. But the key is, what are they saying about the society? Alright, so now, the African compound is centered on the extended family institution and is defined by kinship relations. So, who are you descended from on the mother's side? Who are you descended from on the father's side? These relationships determine certain things. you've got the age grading system. You know, because everything in the traditional African society is based on age. All of us are too young to participate in running the society according to traditional rules. And I'm about to be 42 years old, and they're like, I'm still too young. Because in the traditional society, you don't know that. What are your experiences? What have you done? You need to sit back, shut up. What's interesting about a traditional African university like a Timbuktu was that when you went to Timbuktu, you had 3 years of study. You know what you did for your first 2 years of study? You just read and studied and shut up. Because they said, you have nothing to contribute. You don't know anything. You didn't write anything or speak, give your own opinion or views until your third year when you were writing your dissertation and graduating. And then once you had done all your writing, you didn't get your turban, you didn't get your cloak, your turban, that was your symbol of you had graduated until you could defend everything that you'd written orally. You couldn't do it. I mean, that's a traditional African saying, okay, you don't know nothing. So everything is based on age. Now, in an African setting, when we develop societies and we have everything based on the family, the extended family and kinship relationships, then you add all that up, or in economic terms, we say you get an aggregate, or the aggregation. And that just means that you've added up all of the different compounds that are out there. And now remember that since we got extended families, you might have one compound, everybody might be descended in one area from the same ancestors. Then you got another compound and with a bunch of different extended families and all these different compounds add up, you got a clan and you get up further than that, you got the village level and you go beyond that. And the different, even though you'll have these different compounds of kinship relationships, and some might be from different ethnicities, because of marriage, that starts joining one family compound from one ethnicity to another compound. And eventually, when you aggregate it all up, you have an African pluralist society. It's plural, just like Tanzania. You've got 120, 130, huh? Yeah, different ethnic groups. But you can see that they're all connected and joined by marriage. I've been to 3, 4 weddings since I've been in Tanzania. Really different ethnic groups. So the same way that things are set up here, where you don't have any conflict in that pluralist setting, this is a part of the traditional African social development. Alright, then once you get up to the village level, then you can go you start bringing together different villages, and you have a nation. And generally, that nation will be connected based on a common ancestor. But then, because of marriage, you might have different ethnic groups that are all together and then forming a part of that nation as well. Alright, and then from the village, you go up to the cities, then to the state, and then from the states, you get up to some type of confederation. Because in an African setting, we don't go with a strict federalism where you got a central government that tells everyone, but you have a loose confederation. So you might have Nyakusa, then you might have Wahehe, and they're all under one government, but it's a loose federation. So the majority of the most important things of life, they handle on their own. Then there are certain things, trade with other nations, or stuff like military, things like that will be handled by the central government. So it's some type of loose confederation. Alright, and sometimes within the African setting, you'll have them, not only will you have a loose confederation, we have examples, but sometimes you get the establishment of empires. Sometimes these empires are established through force, warfare. We can use Askia Muhammad in West Africa with the Songhai Empire, or the empire maybe like the one that Tetutueo established in Southern Africa. The empire he put together, as long as you come up, he would give people a chance to join peacefully. They preferred, so he built a paramountcy, which is basically a loose empire, but it wasn't necessarily based on force. Some people, the majority of the folks say, they were smaller people, so they thought they could protect their interests better by joining his the greater nation that he was putting together. So, these are some of the ways that we create the modern state. But now, if we're going to understand African social organization, African development, then we need to understand how we organize and put together things on the political level. And the reason we need to understand it is because the politics or how you organize things is going to play a key role in shaping the economics, the social organization, everything. And it's all going to be based in culture. A couple class periods ago, I gave you two proverbs. Nini, Pasababu, Ibini. And then the English, I think, therefore I am. Two whole different things. Now, it seems that, okay, this is just a couple, it could seem like those are just two sentences. But in reality, those encapsulate two different sets of values. Two different values. So, when we look at something like, I think, therefore I am, here are some of the values that go with it, because that's a Western value system. And so when they start telling you, I think, therefore I am, and what we're talking about now is those two proverbs tell you all about the worldview of the people who create it. So in the European worldview, I think, therefore I am, so the highest value in life is the things that you acquire, which you receive. You get knowledge when you're able to count and measure. Because you're focused on the I think, therefore I am, you have a conquest mentality, therefore you want to control and dominate. Everything for you is separate because you define yourself as a separate individual. I think, therefore I am. I am because of what I can do. Then you're separate from everything else. Everything is separate. Your mind is separate from your spirit is separate from your body is separate from your mind, all of these, everything is separate. Because it's I think, therefore I am, your key philosophy is going to be survival of the fittest. So, and then your focus is on resource exploitation. Because you're not connected to the resource. The resource is going to be something you use. Alright, and you're separate from everybody else. So with that type of value system, you can do things like your child reaches a certain age, you tell them they have to go out and make their own way in the world. You put them in the house. You don't provide them, you've given them the life lesson. Now they have to go out and make things on their own. That's all grows out of I think, therefore I am. But I am because we are different set of value systems. The society exists before the individual. That kind of makes sense. Before any of us were born, whatever society that we were born into, it already existed. So the group exists before the person, so that the group is the reason for the person, and the person can only understand themselves through the group. Think about it. When you were born, you learn everything from the extended family. the entire group. And right now, when we define ourselves in relation to the group. If I say I'm Christian, I just define myself in relationship to a group of people who call themselves Christians. Or if you say you're Muslim, to a group of people who call themselves Muslims. Or if you follow a traditional African religion, the group of people who follow traditional African spiritual system, you define yourself through them. I am, because we are, leads to everybody complements everyone else. The way that a man complements a woman. The way that human beings complement nature. When we look at, first off, because we are, then we see a connection with the Creator. There is a God, and we see a connection there. All of this grows out of that value system. I am because we are, we then say all of us are equal. No one is greater than the other one. That means we build economic systems that make sure that everyone is taken care of. And the other thing it says, we value relationships. I am because we are in relationships. So we value the relationships. We value the contact and the human interaction. Alright, then you should live in harmony with nature. So, that value system leads, those two statements lead to two totally different sets of value systems. So now, before any European conquest with the express intention of getting their hands on African resources, the whole purpose of social organization, and I'm using as an example Nile Valley civilization. And so the purpose of life was to make the individual a better person. Your whole goal in life was to make one a better person. A higher state of individual, a higher person, a mature person, a developed person, an aware person, a balanced person, a person in harmony with their surroundings. So that you get the whole concept that it was important to know yourself, but you could only know yourself through the group. And you could only know the group through the ancestors who established the group. So you had to follow that link in order to understand who you were. Because the philosophy clearly understood that you are the ancestors reborn. I think in India they have the concept of reincarnation. Well, within the traditional African setting, the idea is that you are the ancestors who are reborn. We can see that genetically at the physical level. You start to look back at old pictures and you look like people who've been dead for 50, 60, 100 years. And the genetics tells us there's an even deeper connection. Well, 8000 BC, African civilizations were telling you that is key, and so they organized the entire society around that concept. And your whole goal was to be more godlike. You wanted to be like God. Hence, the word religion means to tie back, to bring in closer connection to. Alright, so now, and then he said in order to do this, you had to train your mind. You had to be able to think. So first off, you had to identify yourself with something greater than yourself, something greater than the community, something greater than the group, something greater than the nation. So the connection was with the Creator. Traditional African society did not separate religion from the state, from economics, from politics. There's no disconnect. Everything is related. So now, think about when you're engaging in economics, if you're making yourself aware that everyone that you're engaging in economics with is a reflection of the Creator. So that when I look at each person, I see God looking at me. So if that's my thought process, well, I don't think I want to spend my time trying to cheat God or steal from God. or I'm going to sit back while God doesn't have, and I have. Because in the African, when you look at beginning with human development, like I did yesterday, in the African setting, a person is considered divine because you are made from the essence of the Creator. I use the Zulu as an example. And this article here, the title of it is Zulu Traditional Healing, African Worldview, and the Practice of Ubuntu. Deep thought for African Black Psychology. And one of the things he gives at the very beginning is he talks about the name Zulu. And I'm using Zulu as an example. The name Zulu means God's people for the people of heaven. And it's not just the Zulu who have this meaning. The Khoi people of Southern Africa, their actual name literally means men of men. I believe it's the people who the Europeans call the Dinka in the Sudan. Their name means children of the Supreme, the great God. So when we look at, and you can find that in all African ethnic groups. When you look at the defining name of the people, in some way, shape, or form, it connects back to the Creator. Look at all of these different religions. You look at the different names to go with the religion, everything relates back to the Creator. Alright, so with the Zulu, their name actually ties them back. They're defining themselves as a spiritual people connected to the divine. Because in the traditional African setting, each individual is divine, each individual is spiritual, each individual is a representation of God. That's the foundation of the culture. So because that's the foundation of the culture, the way they developed the societies grew out of that region. Since everyone is a reflection of God, everyone must be taken care of. So you don't build an individual economic system. You build an economic system that's based on taking care of everyone. Alright, so then the education in traditional African society in the Nile Valley. Focusing on you have to master the language. Grammar. You need to know the rules of language. Because if you don't know grammar, then when you have a discussion with someone else, when you're talking, the two of you will have, be saying the same, using the same words, but have different meanings. So you had to study grammar. You had to learn how to discuss rhetoric. And with rhetoric, the first basic lesson had to deal with pros and cons. Understanding that there were multiple views to something. Understanding that every thought has a lot of different assumptions underlying that thought. Then you had to study logic. So all of these were three things, because that was training the mind. Grammar, rhetoric, logic. Rhetoric, you're dealing with the speaking, the rules of public speaking. Logic, you're dealing with the rules for argument, the rules for discussion, for debate. Yes, because you're training the mind, the analytical portion of the mind. And when you train the analytical portion of the mind, you can be a person that can think critical. You can't pull anything open because they know the correct questions to ask. Whenever someone tells them something, the correct question to ask, they know what it is. So traditional African education focused on those three things. Also, it dealt with the issues of studied geometry, arithmetic, and you studied those because now you had to understand the wider perspective. Alright, so if you're going to solve problems, you're going to solve personal, social, political, or economic problems, then you must have a mastery of the inductive method. You must understand mathematics and geometry, arithmetic and geometry. And I have a little thing I pulled up. Most of the time we study math, and this says we study math, and we just kind of study math, and we learn how to add, subtract, and learn algebra. all those different things. But here are some of the things you're supposed to be gaining from this. For example, mathematics literally means knowledge, study, learning. You're studying quantity, structure, space, change. You're supposed to be able, with mathematics, you can see patterns and formulate new ideas or conjectures. When you're sitting in math class, all of the different math classes, the skills you're supposed to be leaving those classes with are supposed to enable you to do that. To be able to reason. Because the word reason literally means ratio. And we understand what a ratio is, right? 3 to 1, 1/3, those are ratios. Ratios are imprecise. Because they understood that reasoning is not a precise thing. Reasoning, you don't have a fact. A fact is only a fact based upon the reasons that support it. So that you can have a multiplicity of ideas, and they are as valid as the reasons upon which they are based, as the culture that gave birth to them. That's what you get from mathematics. Some of the stuff you get from mathematics. See, if you can engage in mathematical reasoning, then you understand patterns. For example, mention their history. If you know the history, you look back at the history, and you look at the history of a group of people, you see certain patterns in the way those people behave. And so, if I take a group of people that for the past 10,000 years in their history, they behave a certain way based upon the history of these people, math will tell you that there's a high probability that those people are going to continue to do that today. For example, if I look at the history of Europeans over the past 10,000 years, I can look at that history and get an idea of exactly what they're going to do today. If I can think mathematically, I won't be surprised. But if I don't master mathematics, then I'm going to look at a people's history and I'll miss all kinds of stuff. And I was like, well, maybe this time they'll be different. It's kind of like if you got that person who's always around you and they always do you wrong. They do something that's just terrible. Every time. You give them another chance and they do wrong. You give them another chance and they do wrong. So pretty soon, you begin to understand there's a pattern in their behavior. That's a mathematical skill that we get. So you have to, if you're going to solve problems, you must understand geometry and math. Arithmetic and geometry. You must understand those two things if you're going to solve problems. And so, when you look at government, when you look at economics, the number one science in both of those, mathematics. You need to study calculus to understand rate of change. So, when you study accounting, you see differential calculus in accounting. The rate of change. And you're breaking down the rate of change. That's what calculus is all about. Algebra is a language which teaches you to take all these words that I just finished saying and put it in a very small equation. So you don't write, all of the different symbols mean a bunch of different words. Those are some examples of how you use these mathematical sciences for reasoning. Alright, then you also, in traditional African education in the Nile Valley, you study astronomy. You studied astronomy for agriculture because African society is traditionally based on agriculture. Everything grows up there. I'm growing that cotton. I use that cotton to make clothing. I'm growing a variety of boba to feed myself. I'm growing certain types of grasses and whatnot to feed the livestock because I need the milk from the livestock. With the sheep, I may shear the sheep and use the wool to create a host of different things. So everything in the African setting grows out of agriculture. So agriculture is the basis of all African societies. And notice what they did here in Tanzania beginning of the 60s. Every study in Tanzania beginning in the 1960s has stated and continues to state that and then development must be based on agriculture. That's the traditional African focus. Because out of agriculture comes everything else. Now right now you have three more quantities. Same concept. Different names, different programs, different same concept. Alright, so you studied astronomy because you needed that, but they also studied astronomy for the spiritual connection. You know, biologically, women are in tune with the moon, men are in tune with the sun. Men, we have a cycle too, it's with the sun. So, you know, when the sun hits certain periods, you know, we start acting a little different. Women, you move along with the moon. The moon has like about a 28-day cycle. The sun has something like a 30-31-day cycle. It's just, pay attention to how men begin to act the next time you see something in the news talking about sunspots or all of these other things that occur with the sun. Pay attention to the moods that go along with it. So we studied the traditional African societies, they studied that, and we still see that now as Africans, even though we might be practicing Christianity or Islam. You find the astronomical, the spirit, the mystical astronomical aspects in Islam and Sufism. And the largest form of Islam practiced in Africa is Sufism. You find it in Christianity when you start to look when they look at the Gospels, and you see them talking about the sun and the moon serving as signs and symbols. For instance, birth of Christ, you know, a star pops up in the heavens, and there's a baby being born. So you still find that within us as African people, we bring that along. So we adapt the religion to our traditional culture. And I know we all know people who they might be Christian, they might be Muslim, but some happen, you know, they go to the traditional healer. Because the traditional healer got a lot of wealth of wisdom that's been used. That's a part of the astronomical study of African science. And then also they understood that they studied astronomy because we're connected to each other. Like right now we're all connected because we're all breathing the same air. We're breathing it in, breathing it out, and somebody else breathing in, breathing it out. That's one basic connection. But we're all connected. So, then they use astronomy to help them understand that. Alright. Then they study music. Every African traditional culture, music is a very key part. It plays a very key role in ritual, and we understand the connection between human psychology and music. You know, the connection between human psychology and colors. Different colors vibrate at a different frequency. Music is nothing but vibration. You ever notice how you certain songs, because they're written in a certain musical key, make you feel a certain way? You could be feeling like horrible, and a certain song will be played, and then you start feeling kind of mellow, you feel good. That's all growing out of the knowledge of traditional African culture in the use of music. Alright, because music was the complete and total practice of philosophy. Music in the traditional African society was philosophy set to rhythm. Alright, so now, that's the educational system. Those subject matters make up the educational system in the traditional African society. And that gave you the basis that you needed to go and be apprenticed to somebody doing whatever it was. Whether you were going to be a lawyer, then you would be an apprentice to a lawyer. If you were going to go into blacksmithing, you would be an apprentice to a blacksmith. Whatever the situation was, you would move with that foundation, you would move out into those different areas of the society. And you didn't become a lawyer, you didn't become a teacher, you didn't become a blacksmith, you didn't become a tailor or a seamstress, you didn't go into agriculture to become wealthy. You went to improve the community, because everything was done towards the community. You didn't go into government so you could become filthy rich. You went into government because you wanted to serve the community. Everything that you were doing was in the best interest of the community. That's your ethical system growing out of traditional African culture. And so everything was focused in how can we live together in harmony. Alright, so, and they were talking about how can we live together in harmony economically, politically, and then they wanted to make sure that what they were doing was in line with the way it had been done by ancestors. Yes, things change, but certain things they maintain over time. So that you might look at one period in a traditional African culture and they are utilizing stone tools. You look at another period and they're utilizing iron tools. But the basic ethics of the culture stay the same. Treating your neighbor the way you want to be treated stays the same. I don't care if you're flying in an airplane or if you're walking in the way you want to go. That basic foundation of the culture stays the same. And Walter Rodney gets into that when he's talking to you about communalism. Because communalism is based, look at the word itself. You got communalism. That takes us to the word communication. And we also get the word community. And all of this is, and so communalism, the African organization, way of organizing a society, is based on communication, and its focus is the community, the group. Progress in the group, moving the group, satisfying the needs of the group. So that, and because that's the focus of the society, if we're all farmers, and maybe I have this great bumper crop, when I'm farming, I'm doing real well. You know, my herd is growing, the crops are growing, all of that stuff, and somebody else may not be doing as well. Well, I don't just sit back and talk, I'm just doing good. I take what I've done and I give it away. I give away to those who need help. I start with the family giving it away, and I branch out. And I consider myself a success in the traditional African setting because I was able to give it away and everyone else could eat. And I was happy to sit back and watch. Wasn't even hungry. I could watch everyone enjoy all of my labor. Then once I've given it all away, I go back and do it all over again. Alright, and so now. So, another aspect of it is dealing with health. The focus being on food, housing, clothing, disease prevention. And when we talk about disease prevention, one of the things when you read those old studies over in the library on traditional African societies, there was no cancer. There was no cancer. European doctors came into Eastern Africa, they were in Kenya, and Western Africa, they were in Benin. Albert Schweitzer was one of the doctors who wrote about this. So if you Google Albert Schweitzer, you should pull up, actually if you Google the topic, cancer is a cancer created by Western civilization, you'll pull up some articles on this subject. And what Schweitzer and them found in the early 1900s, Albert Schweitzer said when he went to West Africa in the late 1800s, he was surprised that there were absolutely no cancer. As a matter of fact, he didn't find any fat people. And another doctor was in Eastern Africa, in the Kenya, in the early 1900s, and he says when he came in the early 1900s, he said the Kenyans were as skinny as the ancient Egyptians. Then he came back in 1950, and he said he saw his first fat Kenyans. And so when he was looking at what had caused the change, and he also found the first people suffering from cancer. And he said that as the people began to adapt Western civilization, Western diet, the stress of Western living, being focused on the clock, and all of that stress that came with Western society, then you started finding cancer. And you started seeing people who were obese, and people who were dying before the age of 100. Boy, it wasn't unusual to see people. Matter of fact, the Europeans in those studies, like, they would see Africans, and the people would tell them that they would think that they would ask the person how the person was. They'd say, "Oh, I'm 60." And they would look at the person didn't look 60. The person would say, "Oh, I'm 80." They looked like the person was 80. And so, because in our traditional setting, when we maintain our own natural diets, we age very slow. I remember when I got here, and I was talking to this lady, and she said that she was 60. I was like, what? She ain't but 60. And then when I said I was 39, she was like, "You're not 39, you're lying." I said, "Yes, I'm 39. I remember when I was 16, and I went to go and enlist in the U.S. military. I thought I wanted to be in the Army. But I went to enlist in the military, and when I got there, they were like, "God, what you doing here?" They laughed at me. And then I had my birth certificate, I had all those people did not believe. When I tried to get a passport to leave the U.S. to go travel, the FBI came to my family house. They wanted to make sure, because they said this person does not look like a 24 years old. But when we maintain a natural, holistic diet, basically eating the things that people eat here, when you start eating Western foods, then you start having all the health issues. But when you eat a traditional African diet, you just kind of move on, everything's all nice. You don't gain weight, and kind of that. You ever look at the people, look at those books again in the library, when they show you pictures of traditional African people in traditional societies. Especially look at the ones from the Sudan. Those are real predators. Notice what you don't find. You never find overweight people. And these are people who look like they're just in great physical condition. But they're supposed to be primitive. Anyway, health is a key aspect of the traditional African society, so that people spend time studying what things were good for you to eat, what things were not good for you to eat, how you should eat a lot of this, you should eat a lot of that. All of these things were the part of African development in traditional sense, all growing out of agriculture. Alright, so when they engaged in politics, the focus was on achieving the supreme good of the society, and so you acted in that way. Now, Walter Rodney, in his book, in chapter 2, he's breaking that down for us. He opens up, he tells you, now, his first statement, he wants to make sure you understand that Africa today is underdeveloped in relation to the Western Europe and other parts of the world, not because we don't know how to develop societies. It's underdeveloped because of exploitation, which grows out of domination. So when we study development and how we got to where we are, we have to start with one word: domination. And we are not dominated because, and domination means we lost the war. We have to face it. We fought, we lost. But we didn't lose because we didn't know how to win, or we didn't know how to be great generals. No, because I've got a book, and it shows you African resistance to European and Arab approaches. And as long as we had the same military weapons, there was no victory for them. There was no victory. As a matter of fact, if you look at Southern Africa, in the 1870s, the Zulu Empire fought the British to a standstill. The only way the British defeated the Zulu was they would say, we're going to have this meeting, and then when we believing being people of our word, we come in and they would capture the leaders once they say they were going to have some type of meeting, A, and B, they used other peoples, African peoples, in their military to help them understand our military techniques. So they used a divide and conquer situation. So it wasn't like the Europeans came in, they had guns, and they just killed us all. No. Yeah, they had guns, but you had different African leaders who acquired guns in a variety of ways, started developing their own guns, and were taking the war to the Europeans. The only reason that the Germans were able to semi-defeat the Wahehe was using other peoples in the military. And then, when they came, they built Iringa for one reason, because it was overlooking the Hehe homeland, because they had to actually have a physical presence here, because there was constant revolt against the Germans. But they didn't, it wasn't a case of they came in, they beat us, and that was it. But we have the issue of domination, which basically means we won a lot of the different battles, but we ended up losing the war. So that's the first thing. So when you deal with domination, it means we lost the war, we were conquered, and then the peoples came in and they brought in colonies. See, we Africans are not the colony. We're the conquered people. The colony was the Europeans who moved in. They were the colonials. If I use the United States as an example, the United States, when it was started as 13 British colonies. It didn't include the Native Americans and indigenous peoples of the Americas. It was only the English people and the Germans and the French and all of those who were the colonials. Same thing here. That's called a settler colony. So what they did was, we lost the war. They set up military forts and whatnot to try to maintain the peace. They recruited the African, so if you came here and the Wahehe was a strong group, they recruited other peoples, their soldiers from other peoples that they had conquered to serve in the military, and those peoples may, for whatever reason, may have had something against the Wahehe. In South Africa, they would recruit other peoples who had something against the Zulus because they'd been conquered by the Zulus or whatever it was, and they used that same policy around the rest of the continent, so that the colonial governments were mainly staffed by African soldiers, the colonial armies were staffed by African soldiers with mainly European officers. The majority of those colonial militaries, that was the way the setting was set up. So we lost the war, they brought in a settler colony. They used a term that I might use it in his book 2000 Seasons, the term we have from the Swahili term, Jastari, and the term was literally used to describe an African who was serving in the colonial military. So they recruited Askari. So they brought in the settler colony, they recruited Askari, then they brought in scholars. They brought in the scholars to study traditional African societies so they could see how to change the society from a self-sufficient society to one that would be exporting crops to Europe. Crops and wealth. And then, after they brought in the scholars, along with the scholars and along with the settler colony, you can put in the missionaries. And so, then after the scholars, they set up educational institutions. And the whole purpose with that of setting up the educational institutions was specifically to, the whole point was to specifically create a colonial elite. So they wanted to train the best, quote unquote, of the Tanzanians specifically so that, they could use them to fill civil service positions. And Rodney is giving you all of this in his book. And the last thing I want to end with today out of here is at the very end of the chapter, something he points out, which is that he says, well, one thing he tells you that in the studies, slavery did not, he says, it should also be read that slavery as a mode of production was not used in traditional African societies. You did have people who were called slaves as a result of conflict between different societies. Those persons were adopted into the society. And so he says we did not get into people used forced slavery to build anything. And the other thing that he pointed out that was important was that the last thing I wanted to say is when he looked at what an imperial society was, he said he looked at Egypt during the period after the Muslims conquered Egypt. And he said during the latter period, the ruling class was foreign, and that meant that Egypt's internal development was tied up with countries, notably Arabia and Turkey. He said colonized Egypt sent abroad great amounts of wealth in the form of food and revenue. So the Turks and the Arabs colonized Egypt, and then Egypt was sending home food and revenue to Arabia and Turkey. The reason I point this out because he says that, then he says, and that was a very negative factor. And then he says that the tendency was for the ruling foreigners to break with their own imperial masters and act simply as a ruling elite within Egypt. It became an independent feudal state. What he describes about Egypt in 700, 800, 900 AD is the situation you have right now in Tanzania. Because you had a foreign settler colony that established a government here, and then they were sending food and revenue back to Europe. Then, at independence, a trained colonial elite merely took over the positions of the former white colonies, kept the same government, and for the most part, kept the same economic situation. So that the country in 2012 is doing exactly what the country was doing in 1954. Sending food and revenue to Europe, and now just sending it to Europe and the U.S. Alright? Now, I've given the class representative a copy of the outlines, and you'll see the readings that are coming due next. And all of the readings are on that website that I gave you. I gave photos. It's 3 different books. Right now, next week, we'll finish up Walter Rodney, and you'll see in the outline that we'll move on to severe means, maldevelopment. Then we'll look at Transpanon's book. And next week, I will give you your development project. I'm going to give you the question outline, and you're going to choose what problem of development that exists in Tanzania that you're going to actually solve the way a development specialist does it. And I'm just going to give you the outline, and all you have to do is follow the outline. But you're going to have to do a lot of library research. Remember that. So I will see you next Tuesday.